Hey, everybody. Thought I would take some time tonight and see how everybody's doing. Just let me get this shared in a few different places, and I will be back. Hi, Tommy Thomas. Hope you're doing all right. Yeah, all right, just a second. I've got to email something. Sorry, this is just taking a minute. I will be with y'all in just a moment. Hi, everybody. Shout outs from Utah. Hi, Koopa in Utah. Does every book in the Bible line up well? No, the books of the Bible absolutely do not line up well. All right. Greetings from Kansas City. Hope you're doing all right. In KC, I was there a little bit ago. Great 1 hour video today. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. That was a different experience. That's much longer than I normally post, but hopefully the quality was okay and everything went well. Have you ever discussed Campbell's concept of Occidental versus Eastern religion? I haven't, but that's not a very helpful dichotomy. I think that's considered quite outdated. All right. Definitely looking forward to more long-form content. No pressure. Well, I think as I'm kind of migrating my home base from TikTok over to YouTube, since TikTok doesn't seem to be long for this world, or at least this nation. So, yeah, I think that's probably going to happen more in the future. Nathaniel asks, why are the Bible books ordered the way they are? Well, it depends on what order you're talking about, because if we look at the Hebrew Bible, the Jewish canon orders things a little differently, and we've got the law, we've got the writing, and we got the prophets, and the prophets include a lot of the stuff that we would call the historical writings from a Christian point of view. And it ends with 2nd Chronicles, and with this promise of return. And so that's kind of ties off the Jewish canon with that hope of restoration. And Christians reordered things to end with Malachi, which has this promise of the return of Elijah. And then the very next thing that we see is the opening of Matthew, which is the description of the advent of Jesus. And so that kind of is a segue into what we have in the New Testament. And then the New Testament books are in the order they are, primarily because the Gospels went first, and then the Acts was something that was written perhaps by the same author as the Gospel of Luke. And then you have the Pauline writings, and they're ordered primarily longest to shortest, with the ones that have pairs, siblings, attached directly to them, even if they're much shorter. And then Hebrews is kind of at the end, because we don't know where to put that. And then we have what they call the Catholic epistles, which are epistles of John, epistles of Peter, epistle of Jude, and then Revelation tacked on at the very end, probably the last book to get added to the canon. Sorry, I got to get rid of my gum. When did Judaism emerge from ancient Israelite religion? That's a hotly debated question. Ancient Israelite religion probably doesn't survive the exile, so there's something different on the other side of the exile, but whether or not we call that Judaism is still being debated. So some folks might say you don't really have Judaism as we understand it today until the rabbinic period is up and running. So, but there are others who would suggest around the middle of the 2nd century BCE, that's when Judaism starts with the rise of the Hasmonean kingdom, and that's where the scriptures as we know them become really authoritative within Judaism. So there are a variety of different arguments, and it's an argument that's going to continue on for a long time. What is the biggest misconception about the history of the text as a whole? I think the most common misconception, the one that I treat the most frequent, is probably the presupposition of univocality, the notion that all the writings in the Bible are all speaking from one single unified and consistent voice and from one single unified and consistent perspective. So, yeah, that's a problematic one. Do you like Jonathan Hickman's work? I don't know a ton of Jonathan Hickman's work, but what I have read, yeah, I enjoy. And then, yeah, left that up there. I keep doing that. Thomas Hartwell says, speaking of Campbell, I know a lot of literary academics hate him / find him terribly outdated. Is that also the case for religious academics? For the most part, I mean, there are some insights and things that continue to be influential, but in very renegotiated ways. Yeah, Campbell was not really somebody who continues to influence critical scholarship apart from being a topic of discussion from time to time. Could there be a double theophoric name like Yehoyahu? I mean, it's possible. I'm not aware of one. That would be a rather peculiar double theophoric name. Yeah, I don't know that they've done anything like that. Hey, Dan, what are your thoughts on the slightly odd paternity of Isaac? Why would the weird Abimelech story that seems to cast doubt on the very ideas that Abraham is the ancestor of Israel be in Genesis? I think Genesis is probably trying to artificially tie together the cycles of Isaac, of Jacob and Abraham. And yeah, Isaac was probably the more complex one to include, which is probably why it's also the shortest. But yeah, they probably were not part of the same genealogy. That's probably an artificial development. Yeah. Dan, do you do book signings? Yeah, in fact, well, a couple of things. One, dang it. I gotta find a better place for these. I am in the middle of trying to get signed. I was sent by my publisher 1,000 of these book plates, which are stickers, and there's a website where you can go request one of these, and the publisher will send it to you for free as soon as I've finished signing the 1,000 of them. And I have like several of these to go. So that's one way to get signed books, but I also have scheduled several book signings. In fact, we now have the second leg of the Data Over Dogma book launch tour tickets available. So in fact, let me just give me just 1 second. All right. So on April 26th, my podcast co-host Dan Beecher and I are going to start the first leg of our book signing tour. This is something that the publisher, because it's my first book, was not going to give us a budget for a book tour. So we decided to crowdfund one. And so on April 26th, we will be in Chicago. On April 28th, we will be in Seattle. On April 30th, we will be in Portland. On May 2nd, we will be in LA. And you can go to Indiegogo to find the tickets for that. And we have to charge for the tickets so that we can pay for the thing, which turned out to be more expensive than I expected. But in fact, I can give you put these on the screen real quick. So we have the leg 1 is those 4 stops, and that begins on April 26th. Leg 2 is now, tickets are now available for that. This just went live yesterday. We're going to be in Dallas on May 17th. You can see on the right, we're going to be in Atlanta on May 19th. We're going to be in Philadelphia on May 21st, and then we're going to be in DC on May 22nd. So that's the second leg of the book signing tour. And then after that, I have some events that I have been invited to and that I've organized on my own. So it won't be my podcast co-host and me. It'll just be me. On May 12th, I'm going to be at UC Santa Barbara. I'm going to have more details on that forthcoming. On May 14th, I'm going to be here in Salt Lake County at the First Baptist Church of Salt Lake City for an event that's co-sponsored by Brain Food Books and the King's English Bookshop. May 29th, I'm going to be at Benchmark Books, also in Salt Lake County. I'm working on scheduling an event in Clarkdale, Arizona, and another in Denver, Colorado. And then on June 8th, I will be at the Old South Church in Boston. There will be a speaking... Well, I'm actually being given an award by the Old South Church. They invited me out, and then they said, hey, why don't we do a book signing event while you're here? So there will be a book signing event later in the afternoon. And then on May 10th, I'm going to be at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York City. I was invited out there to do a speaking event in coordination with Pride Month, and then they did the same thing, said, hey, why don't we do a book signing event? So there will be a book signing event with that as well. So... And then there will be others that will be forthcoming. But those are the book events that are currently on the schedule. But thank you for that question. I wasn't sure if I was going to remember that I should mention that. Nathaniel, thank you so much for the question. In Luke 8, can people have multiple demons/souls? Multiple souls, like their own souls? Probably not. That's probably not part of first century CE anthropology, but multiple demons, yeah, that's demon possession or spirit possession is something that we find in numerous societies all around the world and down through time. It's certainly what we see in the New Testament, and obviously multiple demons or spirits of whatever kind can take over executive function of somebody according to the text. So I wouldn't say multiple souls, but certainly multiple spirits or demons possessing them. Skyline, thanks so much for the question. Do you have any thoughts on the Al-Yahudu tablets from Babylon? I don't. Depends if I recognize these. Oh, so they are describing the folks that are being brought into Babylon from Judah. I'll have to look more into these. I mean, this sounds like the kind of data that we wouldn't be shocked to come across. But I don't really know much about them. But yeah, I'll have to look into them. Thanks for bringing them to my attention. I don't know that there's a ton that is groundbreaking in there, but yeah, that'll definitely be interesting to look into. Bob Cargill on Data Over Dogma. When? Soon. In fact, I've been talking with Bob about when we can have him on, and we're working on that. But yeah, Bob Cargill is a good friend of mine. We go way back, and yeah, he's phenomenal. I'd love to have him on the show. I recently saw a priest post that turning the other cheek wasn't meek, but assertive. It was a challenge to force slapping the person with the unclean hand. Is this evidence/historically supported? With the unclean hand thing, no. The idea is probably like I've seen a bunch of different attempts to try to interpret this as some kind of subtle requirement that they do something untoward or something disrespectful. The unclean hand thing, I don't think there's any merit to that. I think the most I would say is maybe what it's saying is they're going to have to backhand you, which is a particularly disrespectful thing to do. But even that, I think the rhetoric is really just about not responding to violence or hate with violence or hate. But I do think if there's any case to be made that there's something a little more sneaky going on, I would say the backhand argument is probably the most plausible. Shane, thank you so much for the question. I loved your video about the Immaculate Conception. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Would you please consider doing another video about the other Marian dogmas and how the church truths justify it through Scripture, tries to justify it through Scripture? Yeah, I mean, I've done some in the past, but yeah, I would have to do a little more prep work to do more detailed ones. But yeah, I'd be happy to do something like that. Jacob, on my Discord, by the way, I have a Patreon. If you sign up for the Patreon, then you can get access to the Discord, which has a bunch of chats and stuff like that. And then they have live stream priority. Does Paul really say the Greek equivalent of the word shit? That is, did he cuss? Skivalone is the word in Greek. And yeah, it certainly seems like it. It seems like it's a bit more of a vulgarity than the other options that Paul had available to him. So I think it probably was intended rhetorically to be a little shocking to those ears and to be kind of jarring rhetoric. So yeah, I think it is probably the equivalent of cussing or swearing. Sandra, thank you so much for the question. Have you read John Dominic Crossan's biography of Jesus? I've read portions of it. I've not read the whole thing. I think it's probably a little outdated, but yeah, for its time, very useful. But yeah, I think scholars have moved significantly beyond those discussions. Jeff, thanks so much for the question. In the story of the 10 plagues, God hardens Pharaoh's heart. What does this mean? It means that God made Pharaoh's heart less malleable, made it harder so that he would not have mercy, so that he would remain obdurate and steadfast in his intentions, so that he would do what needed to be done so that God could put their power on display. And so basically what the text says is God wants to perform. God wants to show off. In order to do that, God needs the Egyptians to not let their people go, and so God hardens Pharaoh's heart to make sure that happens. And then the part of the text says Pharaoh hardened his heart, but part of the text also quite explicitly and indisputably said that God did it to Pharaoh. And so people sometimes get a little squeamish about what that says about agency and all that kind of stuff. And yeah, the text says God's the one who did it. There's not really much to say about that. Sketchy Getchy, thanks so much for the question. Outside of Mark, do scholars have any ideas what a primary source was used to compose Matthew? So a long time Q was the hypothesized other source, which Q comes from the German Quello, meaning source, and it's basically this idea is there are things that are shared between Matthew and Luke, word for word or close to word for word, that are not in Mark, and so they must have come from a shared source, and so that reconstructed source is Q, and you can go find a volume in the Anchor Yale Bible commentary series on Q that reconstructs Q and talks about it. Others would suggest that more likely what happened is Matthew used Mark, and then Luke used Matthew and Mark. And I tend to side with that argument. A book I'm reading right now, we're going to have James Barker on the podcast once we can get our schedules figured out, writing and rewriting the Gospels, John and the Synoptics. And he makes the case that that Matthew used Mark, Luke used Matthew, then John used all of them. So That does away with the need for a Q source. Certainly, there were other traditions that were in circulation that all the Gospels probably drew from, but that's something that's still debated among scholars. Adonai receiving an inheritance was a fascinating point from what I have heard. Yeah, I think it's a fascinating point that Adonai seems to be counted among the B'nai Elohim, among the children of God in Deuteronomy 32:8. Arthur, thanks so much for the question. Hey, Dan, I'm struggling to understand how to continue as a believer. With all you have learned in the fallibility of the scriptures, how do you overcome and continue to believe? So my channel's not a here to function pastorally. I don't talk about how I reconcile my own personal beliefs with the scholarship. My channel is just about the data and the scholarship and my professional opinion on things. So unfortunately, that's not a service that I can provide. I would just say that a lot of folks who were raised to think about the world in black and white ways struggle to kind of deconstruct and then reconstruct a worldview where they have a place for faith. Some have a harder time than others. I came into religion as an adult, and I brought with it a lot of perspectives that were more secular, more scientific, and nobody ever disabused me of them. And so my just stance, my worldview, my position is very different from most of the folks who are coming into this having been raised with religion and usually rather conservative religious ideologies and dogmas. And so there's not a lot of help I can provide there. However, there are other folks out there who do a wonderful job, I think. Pete Enns does a wonderful job. He's written a bunch of great books. Curveball is the most recent one he's talked about, where your faith throws you a curve. What do you do about that? The Sin of Certainty is one of his books. The Bible Tells Me So is one of his books. Carla Kamstra recently published a book. In fact, I have it. She published a book called Deconstructing, Leaving Church, Finding Faith, which is about deconstruction and reconstruction. So there are lots of wonderful folks out there who work at the intersection of faith and scholarship, but and I am sorry to have to disappoint in that regard, but that is, I am not one of those folks. But I'm very good friends with a bunch of those folks. Claude Simeon, thank you so much for the question. Is Dan Beecher currently atheist? Yeah, he's long been atheist and will long be atheist. Was he formerly Mormon or other flavor of Christian? He grew up Latter-day Saint, a Mormon. If he had discussed publicly, can't remember all DOD EPs. Yeah, I don't know if he's talked a bit about his past. I think probably the most comprehensive discussion was actually on an interview with Radio West that the two of us did a year and a half ago. So, but I don't know. Yeah, you should be able to find that. Radio West is an NPR affiliate that's out here in the Western United States. But we did an interview with him, with Doug Fabrizio on Radio West a long time ago, and Dan talked about his own background. But I don't think he's talked about it much on the show. Nathaniel, thanks so much for the question. Why is Deuteronomy your favorite book of the Bible? That's got to be because of how different it is. It really changes everything about the history of Judahite religion, but even internally, it's very, very pluriform. There are a lot of different perspectives within it. And I think it has some of the most important passages on the conceptualization of deity in the entire Hebrew Bible. So I've published a handful of things on it. What is deity in LXX Deuteronomy? Is a discussion of how the Septuagint translation of Deuteronomy conceptualizes deity, because it kind of flattens things quite a bit, but it also, from a text critical point of view, reveals some things that have become lost in the transmission of the Hebrew versions of the text. And yeah, Deuteronomy 32:8 and 9, I think, is one of the most fascinating passages in all the Bible, and yeah, seems to suggest that that's the one of the most explicit passages that suggests the original distinction between Adonai and El, and the original subordination of Adonai to El as one of the B'nai Elohim. Jacob asks, any update on when the monotheism edited volume will be released? All the papers have got to be in, the final papers, because what we did was we circulated the drafts after the conference. We were like, okay, y'all have a handful of months to get your drafts back to us. We circulated them among everybody and said, hey, here are everybody's papers. Talk amongst yourselves, share feedback. And then I think in a month, a little over a month, all the final drafts have got to be in, and then we're going to start the editing and the production process. So yeah, it won't be until 2026 at the very earliest that it's actually published. Any interesting facts about the Samaritan religion you can drop? They have a fascinating ritual where they sacrifice lambs on Mount Gerizim. Their Pentateuch has their script. The Samaritan Hebrew is a slightly different script, and their Pentateuch has been preserved in a variety of manuscripts. And I set to work translating Leviticus for Peter Flint a long time ago, when he had a plan to publish an English translation of the Samaritan Pentateuch. And very few differences, but some interesting differences, and particularly where the Israelites were supposed to be on different mountaintops shouting blessings and curses at each other. Gerizim was supposed to be one of the mountaintops. Samaritans have really awesome sukkahs, yeah. Kim, thanks so much for the question. As it is hard to prove truth in the Bible, what is the most useful information in the Bible, in your opinion? The most useful information? It depends on useful to what. Because I think from a historical point of view, I think a lot of the information that we find in Samuel, Kings, and maybe even a little bit in Judges can be pillaged for little kernels of historical accuracy to help us reconstruct the early centuries of the nation of Israel, and perhaps even the development of the nation of Israel. And so there's a scholar named Benz who published a book about, oh gosh, now I forget the name of the book, but it was all about how the nation of Israel developed, and uses some passages from like Judges 9 and elsewhere to suggest how the nation of Israel came together as kind of a confederation of tribes. So I think that's fascinating information from the Bible, but other people may not find that fascinating. So I think in my opinion, the most useful information would probably have to do with how some of the data help us reconstruct the history of the nation of Israel and Judah and the early Judeans, and also the developments and the evolution of the Hebrew language and the Aramaic language. So there are a lot of ways that the text can be useful. Was King James gay? All sources point to yes, or at least by. Was a Bible written when Jesus was walking the earth? A single Bible? No. It would be a long time before there would be a single text. And one of the first things that had to happen was people had to go from transmitting scripture, inspired text on scrolls, to using the codex, which was something that happened probably around the end of the 1st century, beginning of the 2nd century CE within Christianity. Because you can't have everything on a single scroll. You have to break it up, and so you wouldn't have a single text. So yeah, nothing like that in Jesus's day. Your thoughts on Richard Carrier's work, Jesus being fictional/mythical being and Paul making it all up? That's rejected by the overwhelming majority of scholars, and I think the degree to which you have to get very, very creative about how and why this thing was made up and then managed to proliferate and result in all these different variations on it, it beggars belief. Hand of Omega, thank you for the question. Genesis 12, Abram and Sarai are held in Egypt until God sends plagues to the pharaohs, sends them off with lots of loot. Is there any connection to the Moses story here? Could be. I think most scholars would say that probably not a genetic relationship. In other words, one of those texts was probably not looking at the other and going, "Ooh, I'm taking that." But it's not outside the realm of possibility that they both descend from some kind of Ur tradition that they are appropriating in different ways and to different degrees. But yeah, you definitely have Egypt is definitely important, particularly in the 8th century BCE. They have hegemonic power in Israel and Judah. Hezekiah is kind of a vassal to Egypt. We've discovered pots from Israel, from Jerusalem, like handles, jar handles that have the stamp, the Lamech stamp belonging to the king, and it has a little scarab on it, showing the influence of Egypt in the region. So there are a lot of reasons that Egypt could be a main character in a lot of these stories. But yeah, it's certainly possible that they descend from some kind of shared tradition, and perhaps there's some scholarship out there that makes a more thorough argument, but I've not run across it. Kalai, thank you so much for the question. Hi, Dan. Is there any evidence that the Gospels were written in response to the destruction of their second temple, or is it coincidental? I think the destruction of the second temple certainly plays a role in the way, at least, the Gospels were composed. I don't know that it is the catalyst for the composition of the Gospels, but certainly it played a role. But I think there were other things that were going on as well. But yeah, there are others who might have stronger feelings about that. Mark Norman, thank you so much for the question. As a scholar, you don't give credence to the supernatural. Well, since Paul's knowledge of Jesus came from supernatural vision, how do you approach that? Well, I approach it the same way I approach all claims to the supernatural. Show me the data, because if I accept any supernatural claims, I have to accept all supernatural claims. Methodologically speaking, there's no way to say, this supernatural claim is valid and this one is not, because they all require me to suspend critical thinking and critical methodologies. And so if I accept any, I have to accept all. You can't say Paul's knowledge of Jesus came from supernatural events, but Joseph Smith's didn't. Like, on what grounds can you say that? Apart from appealing to historical critical methodologies, which are precisely the methodologies you demand we suspend to accept Paul's claims to the supernatural. So there's not a methodologically sound way to interrogate claims of the supernatural. If you accept one, you have to accept all. And so I accept none. That's just a methodological thing. Should I pursue a career in religious studies or biblical studies? Is it employable? When I first started my undergraduate, I had my teacher who was teaching this Intro to Ancient Near Eastern Studies course say what an awful lot of professors say. Don't take this major. Don't go to graduate school. Don't get a PhD unless you cannot imagine yourself doing anything else. Because it is not incredibly employable. It's not a robust field. It's shrinking, and the way things are going now, we'll be lucky if even high schools exist in 10 years. So it is not incredibly employable. If you cannot imagine yourself doing anything else, by all means do it, but don't count on the traditional get a bachelor's, get a master's, get a PhD, do a post-grad, and then get a tenure-track position. That is increasingly rare these days. From an academic point of view, my career is a failure because a bunch of things. It took me several years to get into a PhD program for a number of reasons, and then I was never able to secure any kind of tenure track position. More and more people with PhDs these days are trying to string together as many different adjunct or contingent faculty positions as they can to try to scratch out a living. I got incredibly lucky that for whatever reason, my social media stuff works and I am able to make a living off of that. And I am phenomenally fortunate, and I am definitely an exception to the rule. So there are an awful lot of scholars trying to find more ways to make these kinds of degrees marketable, employable. And I think that we will see a lot more non-traditional academic routes in the future, like with social media, like with a lot of other approaches that don't involve tenure track positions. But if you're hoping to do BA, MA, PhD, postdoc, tenure track position, like that's incredibly rare these days. So don't count on that. But again, don't do it unless you can't imagine yourself doing anything else. Hayden says, so after reading McCullough's History of Christianity book, have you, sorry, everything updated. Have you caught the medievalist bug? I've been fascinated by a lot of medieval stuff, and if I had another life to live, yeah, I would definitely love to study that. But there are a ton of fields where I was like, ooh, yeah, I wish I had an extra life, an extra, 20 hours in a day. But I don't. Any desire to get more into the Waldensian, Fraticelli, Poor Clarice, quagmire of the 13th and 14th centuries? It's fascinating stuff, but I just don't have the time. I will admit this is a tragedy of the Bible that there are so few mentions of cats and none of small cats, but there are hyraxes in the Bible, sometimes called rock badgers. I have seen and been yelled at by hyraxes in Israel, Palestine, and they are fascinating little creatures. So I would let the super chatter know that there is hope for cute critters. Israelites alleged in Egypt, but no kitten. No, I will have to get to that super chat in a moment. I don't know if I would call hyraxes cute. They are annoying, and they are very loud. Will you consider doing a tour? Would love to see you in Raleigh, North Carolina. I would love to go to Raleigh, North Carolina. There are a bunch of places I would love to go. Yeah, but it's a matter of scheduling it, who's paying for it, all that kind of stuff. So my publisher, my next book, I'm confident that I'll be able to get a publicity budget from the publisher to send me, for instance, outside the United States. But yeah, just bought my Atlanta ticket. Well, thank you so much for the support. Look forward to seeing you in Atlanta. Okay, Josh, thank you so much for the question. Dan, Jesus mentions the days of Noah despite the story of Noah being mythical. What is your take on that? The author of that text thought that Noah was historical. I think there's a problem with trying to center the words of Jesus as inerrant or kind of the point of reference for all understanding of the historicity of the Bible, because all we have are the accounts of these different folks who were not eyewitnesses. So Raleigh, not Raleigh. Well, beg your pardon. I'm sorry. I will have to learn how to pronounce the name there. The YouTube chat is on it. All right. Yeah, I wish I could keep up with all the different chats. Oh, and every time I switch chats and switch back, it starts me back at the beginning. But yeah, all we have in the New Testament, even the words of Jesus, are just somebody else's account. Jessica, thanks for the question. Would you be able to recommend a work that explores the theological worldview and ideas of Martin Luther? Ooh, that's definitely not a specialization of mine. Let me see if I have anything that I have picked up along the way first. Doesn't look like I do. And then let me check and see what I can find that is by anyone that I trust. First one that comes up is by Eric Metaxas. Definitely don't trust Eric Metaxas. Oh, golly. Yeah, the thing is, this is a field in which I don't know a lot of the specialists, so I don't know who's going to be the best. But I'm seeing a lot of biographies that look, they're by reputable publishers that look like they would probably do a good job. Hang on just a moment. A lot more independent publishers than I would have thought. I'm gonna have to take a rain check on that one. I'm gonna write this down though. I don't know if you can hear me speaking on the other side of the microphone. I'm gonna write this down, and I'm gonna go look and look into who has written something trustworthy on that, because a lot of the ones I'm pulling up, I would have questions about. So yeah, let me. Sorry to disappoint, but I'll have to take a rain check on that one. But definitely stay away from an Eric Metaxas biography of Martin Luther. Caleb, thank you for the question. Any fresh thoughts on identity politics and costly signaling? Nothing that I've come up with recently, but I would highly recommend Harvey Whitehouse's The Ritual Animal, which talks quite a bit about this. Imitation and Cohesion and the Evolution of Social Complexity. And in no small part because the book is really a kind of wraps up with talking about what this means for contemporary social issues and how we can approach them and how we can try to solve them when they're rooted in identity politics and costly signaling. But yeah, I certainly don't have anything that I have recently come up with. I'm working on some cognitive science of religion research, but it's not directly related to that. G Dice, thanks so much for the question. Do you have any thoughts on Jezebel's name? I've read many theories, likely a Phoenician name. I looked into it a long time ago. I don't remember what I found, but if you'll give me just 1 second. Where oh, there it is. So in Hebrew, it's Jezebel. I don't know where that J's coming from, and that would mean where is the prince? So Zaval or Zavul is the same as in the name, like you know the name Beelzebub. That's a perversion of what the name would have been, which would have been Baal Zavul, or Lord Baal, or Baal the Prince, or Lord Prince, or something like that. And so Jezebel or Zavul is how it probably originally would have been pronounced. Would just be where's the prince, which would be Hebrew, or at least a Northwest Semitic name. So daughter of the king of Tyre, wife of Ahab. So that would be, yeah, that would probably make it Phoenician, or at least that's where they want you to think it would come from. And yeah, that makes sense. So I don't know that there's a huge mystery there. Yeah, but it's been a long time since I've looked into that. But yeah, it seems to be where is the prince? Hand of Omega, thank you for the question. T-shirt idea, whatever knows tergiversation burns as the touch. I try not to I try not to make T-shirts that are that way, but that would be funny if somebody wore something like that. Hayden says, from a history point of view, I've heard good things about Christendom Destroyed, Europe 1517 to 1648 by Mark Greengrass as a popular level work. It gets into Luther and his relationship to the 30 Years' War that broke out a century later. Yeah, that absolutely, I know that name. That absolutely sounds like something that would be a robust discussion, but obviously not focused directly on Luther. But it's not a Luther study by any means, just an intro to the history and its consequences. Beeson, thank you so much for the question. What are the Nephilim? Nephilim probably means fallen ones. I think in the earliest periods, this is probably a tradition about the ghosts of deceased warriors from some lost golden age or something like that. Later on, it gets picked up as a way to justify God destroying everything with a flood. I don't think it's incredibly clear in Genesis 6 that the Nephilim are the offspring of the union of the B'nai Elohim, the children of God, and the daughters of humanity, because it says they took wives of all those they chose, and they came into them, blah blah blah, and it just says, and the Nephilim were on the earth that day and after. And so I don't think it's necessarily saying they're the offspring. Some scholars suggest that that's an inescapable conclusion. I don't know that I buy that. But then in later periods, particularly once you get into the Hellenistic period, they get reinterpreted as giants. And, you've got First Enoch, which has the offspring of that union being giants, the offspring of the giants being Nephilim, and then the Nephilim die, and their ghosts become the demonic spirits that haunt people and possess bodies and stuff like that. So we're not sure what precisely the Nephilim are. The idea of what they were probably went through a lot of changes and innovation as people were coming up with new ways to make sense of them. Jacob says, a while back I asked which biblical book you'd like to write a commentary on, and you mentioned Exodus or Deuteronomy. If it had to be NT, which would you choose? Interesting question. I think I would stay away from Paul, because Pauline studies scholars are the worst. I'm just kidding. They're not the worst. I have a lot of friends who study Paul, but that field is just enormous and complex and very, very can get kind of vicious sometimes. So I wouldn't dream of trying to write something on Paul. Revelation would be interesting, probably a little too complex. I would probably stick with something like Mark. I really like Mark. Sadib asks, was all of Genesis found in the Dead Sea Scrolls? No, only fragments of Genesis. And if you would like to see everything that was found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's actually a volume that publishes all of that. It's called the, where's the book? It's called Biblical Qumran Scrolls. And it is edited by Eugene Ulrich, Transcriptions and Textual Variants. And don't look on archive.org for a PDF. But that has transcriptions of everything. And looking at Genesis, we have fragments that preserve Genesis 1, verses 1 through 25, Genesis 1, verses 1 through 11, Genesis 1, verses 8 through 10, Genesis 1, 9, Genesis 1, 13 to 22, Genesis 1, 14 to 16, another one has 18 to 21, another one has 18 to 27, another one has 25 to 28. And by the way, all of these are significantly fragmentary. Like when I say it has these verses, I mean it has like 1.5 words from each of these verses. Genesis 2, so got some Genesis 3, got some Genesis 4, some 5, some 6, 17, 18, 19. So there's nothing between Genesis 6:21 and Genesis 12:4. There's nothing between 12:5 and 17:12. Got 18, 19, 22, 23, 24, 26, 27, 34. So we're skipping a bunch of chapters there. Got some Genesis 35, tiny bit of Genesis 36, 37, 39, 40, 41. So we got tiny little fragments of, looks like probably the majority of the chapters. Oh, and then we go from, what do we got? 45, 2 words from 47, and 48, a little bit of 49, a little bit of 50. Yeah, so I would say probably less than half of Genesis is preserved. I was asking because I saw a Reddit post discussing how Ishmael is described differently in Genesis 16 in the Torah from the Samaritan Torah. So I guess the Dead Sea Scrolls wouldn't help with that. Well, you do have in the Dead Sea Scrolls, you have a few different kind of what they refer to as manuscript families or traditions that are preserved. There is some stuff that kind of sides with the Samaritan Pentateuch. There's stuff that sides with the Septuagint. There's stuff that sides with the Masoretic text, and then there's unidentified stuff. So you do have some stuff that sides with the Samaritan Pentateuch, but when it comes to Ishmael, I don't think there's much, if any. Barbara, thanks so much for the question. Any opinion on best and worst apologists? I think apologetics as a field is problematic from the get-go because it's fundamentally dogmatic in orientation. I think the person I responded to in a YouTube video today, Gavin Ortland, I mean, I think his intentions are a lot better than a lot of other apologists I see, and I think there's an attempt to try to thread the needle of academic legitimacy and robustness while still defending the dogmas. And there are an awful lot of scholars who get very, very close to joining the two, but they can never really be joined. So, yeah, Gavin is somebody that strikes me as probably better than a lot of other folks in that regard, but still, I think apologetics is methodologically problematic. And when it comes to the worst, at most everybody else, yeah, I don't know that I would want to name any folks. Red and Blue, thanks so much for the question. Any thoughts on the veracity of the tradition that the Apostle Thomas founded the Christian community in India in the 50s AD? I don't think there's truth to that. That's a tradition that's, while it's earlier than others, yeah, is not based on anything but tradition. And here we get the question mentioned earlier. Israelites alleged in Egypt, but no kitties in OT. Yeah, we don't have any mention of cats. We have mention of dogs, pejorative references to dogs. But yeah, I don't think there's anything in the way of mention of cats. Huh. But thank you for the question. Kern, thank you so much for the question. In Job, God talks about the doors in Leviathan's face. What does this mean? What was the original word used, or is there a better translation? I'm drawing a blank on where this is. Give me a second to find this. And shut the doors of my mother's womb. The stranger kept silence when not out the door. Or who shut up the sea with doors when it break forth? Oh, who can open the doors of his face? Job 41:6. The doors of his face, who can open? I think the face there probably has a reference to, probably means the mouth. So it's like, who could pry open his jaws, something like that. There is terror all around its teeth. So yeah, I think that's the idea is probably something about prying open his mouth or something like that. But yeah, Job has so a lot of weird imagery. All right. Sorry, got a little distracted by a message. Somebody named Shiloh says, my name is in the Bible at Genesis 49:10. Can you explain? I would say the name is in the Bible in a bunch of other places in a more secure way. The idea of Shiloh being the name Shiloh, it's a little problematic. We've got a bunch of Shiloh is spelled a few different ways. It can be spelled Shin Lamed He or Shin Lamed Vav or Shin Yod Lamed He or Shin Yod Lamed Vav. So it can be spelled a bunch of different ways, and it's not perfectly clear that what we have in Genesis 49:10 is actually the name Shiloh as it's used elsewhere. But yeah, we don't know for sure what's going on in Genesis 49:10, so I can't do much by way of explanation. But it seems to have something to do with some kind of rule that is going to return to Judah. Royal authority, tribute, something like that. But I don't think it is messianic, if that's what you're thinking. Reed Packer, thanks so much for the question. Can I get your opinion of the Prince of Ezekiel 40 through 48? Specifically, is this talking about the Messiah or not? Can you give me your best conclusion if you do believe it isn't? It would not surprise me a great deal if it were messianic, but I don't think I have particularly strong feelings about that. Hang on just a second. We got Hanasi. Let's see, to the Prince. Ezekiel 44. Yeah, I don't. This is not something that I've done any direct research on. So I would say it wouldn't surprise me if it is, but I don't really have strong feelings. Yeah, I mean that would be the lowest hanging fruit there. I don't know if that's. I would have to look in some commentaries to get a good idea. If you give me just 1 second, I'll see what some folks that I trust have said about this. Paul Joyce, for instance, is a friend and a wonderful scholar and a genuinely wonderful human being. Let me see. Future royal leader of Israel. So this is probably talking about the restoration of the Davidic kingdom or the Davidic line. But it is a downgrading of royal language. So yeah, at least Paul seems to think it has something to do with the restoration of some kind of royal authority, which was the context for a messianic hope in this time period. So certainly there's overlap there. Grays 174, thanks so much for the question. Do you know of any work like your Divine Image Logic, but for Freemasonry? Ooh, I don't think so. No, off the top of my head, I don't really do much work with Freemasonry. I'm aware that that's a field of study out there, but no, I'm not aware of anything on that. But if you give me just a second, I'm sure I could drag up one or two texts. Okay, so here's a book from Brill, which is a very good, very reputable publisher, called The Handbook of Freemasonry, and that was published in 2014, and that looks like it's got a lot of good papers in it. The Origins of Freemasonry Scotland, The Origins of Freemasonry England, Freemasonry and Templarism, Freemasonry and the Enlightenment, Masonic Historiography. Unfortunately, it looks like it's a very expensive book. And Brill has a lot of very expensive books, so that's not a huge surprise. But, just don't go to Anna's Archive or archive.org or LibGen or any of those places to find a PDF. But yeah, I can't account for any other scholarship on Freemasonry. I don't really know much about it. Can we ask random questions here? Yes. Although I'm trying to respond to a lot of different discussions and questions, so it's not a guarantee I'll get to it. But you say, would love to know what you think about Margaret Barker's Deuteronomist writings. Not a huge fan of Margaret Barker. I think she engages in a bit of parallelomania, draws a lot of connections where they're not really there, and in order to kind of assert certain kinds of significance that are particularly salient to particular ideological groups. So I think her work is not incredibly critical. Nathaniel, thank you so much for the question. Does religious faith only an appeal to magic? No, I don't think it's only an appeal to magic. I think certainly there's a lot in religious faith that overlaps conceptually with what people would call magic, but I think there's also an awful lot that doesn't necessarily. It might not. It doesn't really fit with a secular view of the world. So if you are dichotomizing things into the secular and magic, then you would probably have to say mostly magic. But if there's more to a non-secular perspective than just magic, then I think there would be a lot that wouldn't necessarily qualify as magic. Hand of Omega, thank you for another question. What exactly does Jesus say / mean when he tells Mary not to touch him after rising? What would happen if he's touched? What's the idea here? That's something that's been debated by a lot of folks. I don't know exactly what the idea is. It probably has something to do with an appeal to some kind of literary motif associated with kind of metamorphosis narratives, where gods descend to human form and then go back to divine form. Maybe it has something to do with that. I don't think we have a great answer to that. But if you give me just 1 second, I will check and see if I'm entirely wrong and if all the commentaries are like, obviously this means this. But I don't think that will be the case. Give me just 1 second. Here's a good commentary from Marianne Thompson on John that I can check out. See what Marianne has to say. Jesus' response in a nutshell informs Mary that his appearance to her does not constitute a return to things as they were before his death and resurrection. While that overall point seems clear enough, prickly problems remain in understanding Jesus' words, "Do not touch me." So I was at least right that it's not clear. What exactly does Jesus forbid Mary to do, and why? In the light of Jesus' later invitation to Thomas to put his finger in the wounds of the risen Jesus, Jesus' subsequent words to Mary, "For I have not yet ascended to my Father," are sometimes taken as explanatory. Once Jesus has ascended, Mary will be able or invited to touch him. But that explanation causes more problems than it solves. It assumes that Jesus' return to the Father has taken place between his appearances to Mary and Thomas, and that it is somehow possible to touch the ascended Jesus who is with the Father, but not the risen Jesus who stands in front of her. The text seems to assume, rather, that both Mary and Thomas can touch Jesus. If not, why the prohibition to Mary? The thrust of Jesus' command not to touch him may be illumined by juxtaposing it with Jesus' command to go to my brothers in order to tell them that he is about to ascend to my God and to your God, to my Father and to your Father. For the risen Lord, whom Mary now sees and who can indeed be touched, has not returned to be with her or the disciples, but is ascending to his Father. This is what Mary must go and tell Jesus' brothers. She has not found Jesus' corpse. She has encountered the risen Lord, but there is more. Jesus is now returning to the Father. I guess the interpretation is there's no time, go, or something like that. So yeah, I would take Marianne's words over mine anytime. Wainwright, thank you so much for the question. Bart believes Philippians 2 is about a pre-existing being. Tabor believes this is better situated in the Adam Christology of Paul. I watched your vid on the forum. I think Tabor's view fits Paul. Thoughts? I think that probably the most thorough discussion is Paramon's discussion in his book In the Form of a God, where he reviews the Jewish and the Greco-Roman period uses of morphe and this idea of form of a God, and I think arrives at a conclusion that the majority of critical scholars arrive at, that this is a reference to somebody who's just has a divine form that signals a certain status, and it seems to be that Jesus is had some kind of pre-existent state and is now more highly exalted as a result of this achieving this mission in the human state, the state of a slave, the form of a slave. I think Paul Holloway's discussion in his Philippians commentary in the Hermeneus series is probably the best discussion of what the overall narrative is drawing from. So I would probably disagree with Tabor there, but I'd have to see more of his argument. But yeah, I think Paul Holloway's discussion is probably the best. But thank you for the question. Is there a biblical basis for prioritizing and upholding the nuclear family as the ideal structure? No, not really. That is actually a product of the last century or so, that emphasis on the nuclear family, because prior to that, and it's mainly American as well, because prior to that you had multiple families living in the same household, multiple generations living in the same household, and it's still like that in many parts of the world. And so, yeah, I think this is another attempt to just read what becomes an identity marker for a group into the Bible and say, therefore, this is biblical. The Bible says this is the way it's supposed to be. Excuse me. Wesley Edwards, thank you so much for the comment or question. Any good books comparing and contrasting OT law with other Near Eastern law codes? Yeah, I think it's Raymond Westbrook. Yeah, Raymond Westbrook, A History of Ancient Near Eastern Law, published by Brill. I think there are a few volumes of it, but volume 1 compares, let's see, what we got. Part 1 is 3rd millennium Egypt, Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the Levant International Law. Part 2 is 2nd millennium Egypt, Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the Levant International Law. Part 3, 1st millennium Egypt, Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the Levant International Law. And it discusses biblical law in there as well. Oh, that's volume 2. Volume 2 is about the 1st millennium. So that's the one that's going to more directly discuss biblical law. But that's going to compare and contrast. It's a good work of comparative research. Hand of Omega, thanks so much for the question. Do nuns descend from the Vestal Virgins? I don't think so, but I think that's certainly an influence. And who is the anti-pope, and what happens if he touches the pope? Well, you have to see Time Cop to see the answer to that question. The same matter cannot occupy the same space. So, and then you also have to watch Tyson's fight Sphinx on TV. So that might be a little bit of a deep cut. But Luke, thanks so much for the question. Thoughts on Gnosticism and non-canonical Gospels? There are a lot of them. I don't have any personal feelings about Gnosticism. It doesn't have a really good claim to be a part of the earliest Jesus following. But April DeConnick is a wonderful scholar who has talked a lot about Gnosticism, both in the ancient world and in modernity. For non-canonical gospels, Bart Ehrman and a colleague have published a translation of a bunch of non-canonical gospels. It's called The Other Gospels. In fact, I can pull it up for you. This is just... Sorry, I updated my operating system to Sequoia or whatever it is, and now my browser and Adobe Acrobat, and it always wants to blow up every window to full screen. So here is The Other Gospels, accounts of Jesus from outside the New Testament by Bart Ehrman, and hopefully I'm not too far off by pronouncing that, Zlatko Pleshe. And as you can see, you've got infancy gospels, you've got ministry gospels, got an awful lot of papyri from Oxyrhynchus and elsewhere, sayings gospels and agrapha, passion, resurrection, and post-resurrection gospels, all the way down to the greater questions of Mary. So that's a wonderful volume on that. The New Testament is another one that gathers translations of a variety of different non-canonical gospels, so that's good too. But thank you for the question. Nicholas, are you familiar with the Bible Project and can say anything about the quality of their scholarship and their videos? Thank you for the question. I am familiar with the Bible Project. I think their production values and I think the format and everything is phenomenal. The scholarship it's not quite apologetic, but it presupposes the unity of most of the text. It presupposes its historicity, and it presupposes some inspiration as well. And so I would say it's not critical scholarship, but I think their format and their production values and all that is top notch. So I am jealous of the work that they do. Arthur, thank you so much for the super sticker. I appreciate it. Robert Coates, thank you so much for the question. Any upcoming plans to discuss the Didache? Seems to be popping up on TikTok recently. I have not noticed that. I've talked about it a handful of times, but yeah, that might be a good topic for a video. In fact, I'm going to take note of that. What is the Didache? Because I don't think an awful lot of people know what it is. But yeah, it is an important early Christian document. Thank you for that. Whew. Thank you for that question. I'll definitely have to do something on that soon. Joshua, thank you for the question. Theories on why Christianity, Islam, Judaism arose near each other in a short span and why divine interventions appear to decline after this time. I think that they arose near each other because they are to some degree outgrowths of each other. I think Islam is to some degree if not a response to, at least building on Judaism. Judaism was influential in that part of the world when Islam arose, and I think the rise of philosophy, the power structures that Christianity and Islam put into place made it very, very difficult for anybody else to pop up and say, I've got a new revelation. But then we have the Great Awakenings in the 18th and the 19th centuries that resulted in people claiming divine interventions, and Mormonism is one example of that. So it didn't totally disappear, but yeah, I think there are a variety of different factors that contributed to the decline of claims of the delivery of a new gospel or new scriptures or things like that. But thank you for the question. Tariq, thanks so much for the question. How do we know that Noah's flood literal and global? We don't. I would say that it is definitely didn't happen. There are no data that support it, and we can see kind of the development of the tradition, and we can even see that it probably was not a part of the earliest version of the Noah tradition in the book of Genesis. That is probably a late addition to that as well. So no, I don't think it happened. I don't think there was a global flood. And I think it's a borrowing from traditions that were being circulated within the middle of the first millennium BCE in Mesopotamia. And for the question about Martin Luther, SZ says Martin Luther's Theology, its historical and systematic development by Bernard Loza, very scholarly, very thorough. So thank you for that recommendation. I appreciate you filling in the gaps where I am unable to make recommendations. I appreciate it. Skylar Cat, thank you so much for the super chat, and either Micah or Mika, thank you so much. I appreciate it. And G. Dice, thank you for the question. Jezebel alternative was related to not exalted, dung, or refuse, but I don't know if that was legitimate or highly speculative. That sounds pretty speculative, but I'd have to look into that to see if there's a case to make. Because certainly there are names in the Hebrew Bible that are editorializing, but usually they're slight variations on a real name. So Jezebel's close enough to a real name, and we have examples of other names that are very close to it, that it strikes me as unlikely. But I'll have to look into that. Pardon me. What's up with Jesus teaching in parables, lest they understand and are saved? I think this might be kind of riffing on Isaiah. I think this might be riffing on Isaiah because Isaiah's commission is very similar, where it talks about hearing you, they will not hear, and stuff like that, lest they be converted and be saved. So the idea is probably that Jesus's mission in some sense is reflecting what's going on in Isaiah. Now in Isaiah, that's really kind of a ex eventu thing where we know what's going to happen, and we're kind of putting these words into the mouth of somebody we're situating prior to the events that we know happened. And so we want to account for why the preaching didn't actually convert everybody. And so we say, God made it that way or something like that. And the same could be true of this thing that's being put into, or that's describing Jesus' teaching in parables. These texts are being written decades later, and they know that Jesus did not convert an awful lot of people, and so they might just be saying, oh yeah, well, he taught in parables because he didn't want everybody to figure it out, because he knew that not a lot of people accepted Jesus in his day. Excuse me, it's after 8. It's my bedtime just about. So that's probably what's going on there. Those are two considerations that probably have something to do with what's going on, but I'm sure there are scholars who have delved more thoroughly into that question and would have more to add than I can off the top of my head. Daniel, thank you so much for... Oh, shoot. Sorry, I was in another... I just realized that I was in another window for the thing that I've forgotten what it's called. Discord. So I've got a couple questions to catch up with on the Discord. Thank you so much, Daniel, for the super chat. Philip says, is there anything in the historical record that indicates how the recipients of Paul's letters reacted to them, whether it was okay, message received, sir, or who is this gas bag? Not really, no. Apart from what Paul writes in response to responses to previous missives, I don't think we have any indication at all. It would be nice if we did. That would certainly fill in a lot of gaps. Sadib, thank you for the question. I read on Wikipedia that the Bible doesn't refer to Edom's patron deity Kos because he's too similar to Adonai. Do you know anything about that? I don't think there's a good case to make for that. However, there is certainly a hypothesis. It's usually referred to as the Kenite-Midianite hypothesis that suggests that Adonai was a transplant from the land of Midian. And Adonai, Origin of a Desert God by Miller is one example of a pretty recent attempt to defend the Midianite hypothesis. You can look in Ted Lewis's book, The Origin and Character of God, for a discussion of the Midianite hypothesis. And Lewis basically says, we don't have enough data to know for sure. Hopefully, at some point in the future, we will find more data. Kos and Edom, I don't know that we have enough data to say that that they're really that similar. But there are a lot of nations where the patron deity is not explicitly named. So and there are a lot of times when they get it wrong. So I don't think that there's much to that. Sadib also asked, do you know anything about the Ebionites and Nazarenes who'd influence Islam? That's not one of my areas of expertise, but there are certainly a lot of scholars who have worked a lot on the Ebionites and the Nazarenes. Trying to think if Dermot McCullough's book, A History of Christianity, the First 3,000 Years, if there's some discussion of the I think there's some discussion of the Ebionites and the Nazarenes, but I don't know how thorough it is. But yeah, I don't know off the top of my head much about that. Sorry to disappoint in that regard. Nathaniel, excuse me. Sorry about that. Thank you for the question. Can I.e. or le Jewish pluralism be objective categorized? Probably, I don't know. If you're talking about contemporary Jewish pluralism, I think it can be described. I don't know if categorizing it would hold for very long. I think it would change rather quickly. But if you're talking about the ancient world, there's an awful lot we don't know. Like, in terms of pluralism, what we got? Josephus talking about the 4 different philosophies. There's not a ton we can reconstruct, and there are an awful lot of gaps. So I don't know that it can be categorized in a particularly analytically useful way. Lauren, thank you so much for the question. Why do we only have a fraction of Paul's letters to churches included in the NT? Do scholars have an idea what happened to them? Probably these are the ones that happen to be preserved and happen to be passed around and gain a reputation. And some people think that's why Philemon managed to make it in, because it survived the accident of preservation. And so they were like, well, let's put it in. So yeah, I think there were probably others where maybe the congregation was like, we're not listening to this doofus anymore, and got rid of the letters. Or maybe there were some letters that never made it and got destroyed. Maybe there were some letters that began to circulate, but they were so weird because Paul was having a bad day that maybe people were like, let's not pass this one along. Could be a lot of reasons. And I would say no. I don't think we have much of an idea what happened to other letters. There are some that have been mentioned that we know we don't have. Yeah, I don't know that we can say much more than that. Andrew, thank you for the question. What is point of idol polemic if not denying gods? I didn't understand that point in your Gavin vid about how it's just regarding the statues. So it's basically saying you're worshiping your deity the wrong way, because this is being written in a time when the Judahites are either they're in close contact with the Babylonians, or they have just come back from Babylon, where they are surrounded night and day by idols and by the other gods. And so this rhetoric, I think, is intended to try to disincentivize the Judahites from adopting idols and idol worship. And in my book, Adonai's Divine Images, I make the case that in the exilic period, there's this pivot away from using divine images, and so they need to kind of cement in this anti-divine image polemic, even though all they're doing really is renegotiating what a divine image is. And so I think it is about trying to suggest divine images are bad so that the Judahites will stay away from them. And it's just saying, you idiots, you think that's your God. That's not your God. And that doesn't necessarily mean you don't actually have a God. It just means that's not your God. You're doing it the wrong way. And so that you can send a message to all your in-group saying that's the wrong way. Don't do that. But yeah, my book, Adonai's Divine Images, will go into a lot more detail about that. Thank you so much for the question. What's going on in Genesis 1:26 through 27? Is the plural 26 us a polytheist reference or an honorific plural? It is not an honorific plural. It is a reference to other gods. Most scholars agree this is a vestige of the divine council. So this is the deliberative body of gods that oversees the functioning of the universe. And in this story, God's really the only operative God, but is saying, hey, we're going to do this, everybody. All right, let's go do it. And then God's the only one who actually goes down and does it. God creates man and then male and female. How does this translate? Pretty much how it sounds in English. There's not much else to it. Let me pull it up. And so I'll read this literally from the Hebrew. And said God, let us make human in our image according to our likeness, and they will, and let them rule over the foot, blah, 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 blah. And created he, God, the human in his image, in the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. And it's some prose that, we're not sure exactly what's going on there, but I don't think it is sequential. I don't think the idea is bam, one entity, bam, two entities. I think it is just a poetic way to describe the creation of both male and female humans in the image of God. But yeah, there are a lot we don't know. There is a lot we don't know about what precisely they were getting at. Alpha Centurion, thank you so much for the question. Do you think it is a mistake, as I do, for current Catholic apologetics to turn to Protestant appeal and away from academia/scholarship? I think that's what an awful lot of Catholic apologists who are appealing to the right-wing authoritarians who are having a moment right now. I think there are a lot of young men who, are attracted to that worldview and that kind of group, and so yeah, they're gonna do that. I mean, Mormons do the same thing. They appropriate an awful lot of rhetoric and an awful lot of ideologies from evangelicals and Protestants, which is annoying, but they're gonna do that. But yeah, I think there are an awful lot of Catholics who are very critical scholars and do a phenomenal job, and so yeah, I think it is it what I would do? No. Is it a mistake for them to do it? Well, they're probably going to get what they want out of it. So in that regard, it's not a mistake for them to do it. Do I agree with what they're trying to get out of it? No. But yeah, I think it depends on their rhetorical goals. Danny, thanks so much for the question. Family and I are listening on our drive home, having fun. Thanks for doing what you do. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate that. I hope everybody enjoys. And I don't know how old your kids are, but go to bed as soon as you get home. Because my kids, oh man, that Samuel L. Jackson book, you don't know how many times I wanted to scream the title of that book to my kids, and didn't, but I wanted to. Ryan, thank you so much for the question. Is it possible Mark predicted the destruction of Jerusalem based on religious and political upheaval, or is there something else that points toward post-70 authorship? It's certainly possible. There are a lot of scholars who actually think that like 68, 69, first half of 70 CE is probably when Mark was written, because everybody could see the writing on the wall. And so it's not that astonishing a prediction when it was a foregone conclusion probably in the minds of an awful lot of people. So sure, it's not just possible, it's plausible, and a lot of scholars would say it's probable that it was written before that. But there are others who would say it makes more sense as a post-70 text, and some of them point to other things apart from the destruction of the temple as evidence of that. But thank you for the question. Danny, thanks so much for the question. Seeing a trend of Christians using modern Jewish rituals and holidays like Hanukkah to feel close to Jesus. David Nierenberg says Christianity has long defined itself against/contrary to Judaism. So where does that trend come from? I think there's an attempt on the part of an awful lot of folks today to try to return to the Jewish Jesus, the historical Jesus movement, kind of made that salient to an awful lot of folks, and so they're like, oh well, let's just go try to experience something closer to what Jesus would have experienced by appropriating these Jewish practices, and that's highly problematic and can be very anti-Semitic, particularly in light of the fact that most people are just appropriating contemporary Jewish practices rather than the practices that would have been in circulation in Jesus's day. basically saying these are for us, not for you, which can be profoundly anti-Semitic. And there's a wonderful new book that just came out that I have. I was sent a copy of by the editors, Judeophobia in the New Testament, Texts and Context. And not only does it discuss an awful lot about the nature of Judeophobia, and this is primarily written for the sake of folks who teach in university settings and who run into an awful lot of anti-Semitism in the classroom, particularly in regards to, the violent and vindictive God of the Old Testament over and against the loving and merciful God of the New Testament, that kind of stuff. But it also has, in part two, it goes through every single text of the New Testament and then some to talk about Judeophobia. From the Gospel of Matthew all the way down to Revelation, and then it does the Epistle of Barnabas, it does Martyrdom of Polycarp, does the Gospel of Peter, and the Proto-Evangelium of James, and then has an appendix on two appendices, one on the mean, angry Old Testament God versus nice, loving New Testament God, talking about why that is anti-Semitic, and the other on the Pharisees and how the use of Pharisee as a pejorative term is anti-Semitic. So part of the book is talking about how an awful lot of Christians try to appropriate Jewish practices, and then with a thick shellacking of Jesus on top, which is highly problematic. Stop doing it. And no more Christian satyrs, please. Yeah, and that's exactly what they're talking about. They'll sit down and be like, this is how they do the satyr, and they'll do everything and say, and this is all about Jesus, and which is profoundly offensive and anti-Semitic. So again, stop doing it. And Delasa says, hands off our shofarim and talilot, and no more Christian satyrs, please. Yes, exactly. But yeah, I think the trend comes from rising awareness of the need to situate Jesus within a Jewish context, and then a desire to try to reify some kind of experience like that. Nathaniel, thank you for the question. Does Numbers 12:1 say Zippor is Cushite or beautiful? I thought it was Cushite, but yeah, says Hakushit, Haisha Hakushit, Asher Lakach ki Isha Kushit Lakach. He had married a Cushite, or had taken a Cushite woman. Yeah, so Cushite. Micah, or again, Mika, apologize for not knowing how you pronounce your name. Do you think Revelation was included because it is so exciting? Otherwise, the book kind of peters out for Paul's out. Also, have you read John Caputo's Weak Theology or Tears of Derrida? I have not read those texts. I don't think it's Revelation was included because it's exciting. I think Revelation was included because Athanasius wanted it to be included because it helped him in his rhetoric against a lot of people, the monasteries out in the desert, against the Arians, against Christians that he considered to be lukewarm. It was a particularly useful rhetorical instrument for Athanasius in developing orthodoxy. And Elaine Pagel's book, Revelations, is a wonderful discussion of the history of the book of Revelation, and she has a lot to say about Athanasius and his role in getting Revelation in the canon, so I would recommend that book. Luke, thank you so much for the question. Tips for learning ancient languages. You can't do immersion, so what I would recommend is read out loud from the ancient texts a little bit every day. So you train your ear to hear the correct grammar, the correct syntax, so you get better at pronunciation, and so you can kind of simulate something approximating what immersion would be like. But that will also help you with vocabulary. You don't have to sit down and drill yourself on vocabulary if you're reading out loud from text every day, because you're going to see the vocabulary. And frequently with ancient languages, there's an awful lot of repetition, particularly in the Bible, particularly in biblical narrative. So you're going to see the vocabulary being repeated over and over again. So that will be very helpful. Takes a lot of discipline. It's hard to do in an autodidact way. But yeah, that's what I would say is probably going to be the most helpful. All right, it's getting late. I'm gonna have to wrap it up soon. So if you have not posted a question yet, please save it for another time so I can get through the rest of these questions. what is the significance of the I am statements in the Old Testament, and how do they relate to Jesus in the New Testament? So in Exodus 3:14, Moses asks God, "Whom shall I say sent me?" And God says, "Tell them Ehyeh." Well, he says, "My name is my name for all generations will be Ehyeh Sher Ehyeh," which means I am what I am, or I will be what I will be. And then says, "Tell them, I am sent you." And this is probably a folk etymology intending to link the tetragrammaton to the verbal root haya, to be. This is probably suggesting where that root is, or where that name is supposed to come from. And then when you get into the Septuagint, they translate that into Greek as ego eimi hoon. I am the one who is, or I am the being one. Tell him the being one sent you. But there's another divine self-identification that is also translated the same way, and that is found in Deuteronomy and Deutero-Isaiah, where God says, "Ani hu," I am he. And that is also translated into Greek in the Septuagint as ego eimi. And so Jesus says a number of times ego eimi as a way to kind of wink at that Greek translation of the divine name, which, among other things, suggests that this is taking place on the level of the level of Greek. So this is not what was going on. This is not what was coming out of Jesus's mouth. This is what the authors of these Greek texts are putting into Jesus's mouth. But the idea is probably that Jesus is asserting some kind of identity with the divine name or possession of the divine name, because the divine name was seen as a communicable vehicle of divine power and agency and presence, and the authorized bearer of the divine name could do the things that only God was supposed to be able to do. And so this is why Jesus can both be kind of identified with God, but is also not God, because Jesus is the authorized possessor of the divine name. And you see that in a bunch of places where the divine name is identified as some kind of vehicle for power. In John, for instance, Jesus says, "Protect them with your name, which you have given me," and that kind of stuff. And a friend of mine, Chris Skinner, last year, published a paper in Biblical Research entitled "Ego eimi in Mark and John, Exploring the Johannine Trajectory of a Received Memory of Jesus." I have not read this yet, but because my work overlaps so much with that, I'm looking forward to reading it. And Chris always does a wonderful job. Was God always referred to as a man in the Bible? Yes. There are a couple places where metaphorically God is compared to a nursing mother or a pregnant woman or something like that. That's a lot more metaphorical. That is probably God appropriating the roles of the divine feminine a little later in the development of Israelite and Judahite ideology. But God is fundamentally male presenting pretty much unilaterally in the Hebrew Bible. Anthony, thank you so much for the question. What the evidence, if any, about women bishops in early Christianity? So we have women who are described as holding a variety of ecclesiastical leadership positions in the New Testament, including apostle. If Romans 16:7 identifies Unia as an apostle, which I think it does, and which I think the majority of scholars agree. But you have Phoebe, you have others who are described as deacons, and so on and so forth. And then we also have mosaics and inscriptions and things like that have been discovered in the 3rd, 4th, 5th century CE in Italy and elsewhere that identify women as leaders within church congregations, church communities. Frequently, they were and the only word I can think of is dueña. I don't know what an English word would be for that, but they were the people who owned the houses that were being used for these meetings, and that gave them status within the congregation. So their money was being used an awful lot within early Christianity. So there are a few different types of evidence. It's not as comprehensive as we would like, but the evidence indicates pretty strongly that there were women in ecclesiastical leadership positions. Specifically bishops, I don't know if we have anything that specifically identifies a woman as a bishop, but certainly other ecclesiastical leadership positions. But thank you for a great question. Alan, thank you so much for the super chat. Nathaniel, thank you for another question. I think with Dr. Sledge, you mentioned you've disliked parts of the deconstructionist and atheist community's take on the Bible. Why, or am I mistaken? I don't remember what I said about that, but it certainly sounds like something I would say. And I think if I did say that, it probably had to do with folks who are either denigrating the Bible, dismissing it, as the ravings of Bronze Age goat herders or something like that, which is profoundly misguided. I think there are folks who have dismissed it as something that is unilaterally harmful, that does no good for humanity. I would disagree with that as well. And I think there are also in the deconstructionist community, at least folks who are trying to deconstruct and reconstruct. I think there are attempts to rehabilitate some harmful passages in the Bible that I would disagree with, where I think they're best left acknowledged as harmful. And if we do want to try to say, here's another way to read this, we should build on a foundation of acknowledging that what was originally written is harmful, and we don't want to try to gloss over that. Alan, thank you so much for another question. Why do folks always think the rapture is next week, month? Because they want it to always be relevant to them right now. And so they're always on the lookout, and it's an issue. And but this is something that helps us interpret the biblical text. When we read a biblical text and it's like, oh, this is going to happen. And then we're like, yes, they were talking about what was going to happen 2,700 years in the future. No, they weren't. They were talking about what was going to happen next week, month. And so that's just a tendency of humans, is to want things to be imminent and want things to be about them and want things to be things that are going to that they're going to experience, that they're going to witness, that are going to be salient to them. Ryan, thank you so much for another question. The long ending of Mark endows Christians with superpowers like tongue speaking, snake handling, and poison drinking. Are we seeing some pagan rituals creeping into Christianity? I don't know that they're pagan rituals. Certainly there were similar things already going on to some degree within Greco-Roman period Judaism, but could be. And I don't know that. Yeah, I would have to look more at that, but certainly this is a late addition to the Gospel of Mark. So this is something that's going on a little, or becoming salient a little later in the development of early Christianity. But certainly all of Christianity is a synthesis of social and cultural influences. The notion that any version of Christianity is kind of pure Christianity is just pure and utter nonsense. There's always going to be influence from the surrounding world. I apologize, I'm going to mispronounce your name, unless you're trying to get close to Kaiser Soze. But thank you so much for the question. Hello, Dan, I love your vids. Thank you, I appreciate that. But I'm having trouble with Jesus' claim as Son of God in John 10:36 through 38, and the Jews' accusation in John 19:7. When I cross-reference it, it goes to Leviticus 24:16 and Deuteronomy 13:1 through 5. Give me just 1 second to pull some of these texts up. And the cross references are going to be the work of folks who are reading these from within a Trinitarian tradition. Well, this just looks like regulations about blasphemy, but blasphemy could be a lot of things. Yeah, blasphemy doesn't necessarily mean claiming to be God. It's any kind of ill speaking of the divine, up to and including appropriating the divine identity or divine powers or divine prerogatives. And so the argument that the fact that they wanted to stone him means they knew he was claiming to be God is pure and utter nonsense. Like, that manifests a very poor understanding of the nature of blasphemy and its accusation in the first century CE. Because you had, the New Testament talks about people blaspheming Paul and things like that. And blasphemy can be just any kind of insulting language about God. So yeah, I don't think that argument really challenges the framework I've developed for understanding how the earliest Christians thought about Jesus's relationship to God. But I'm working on a paper right now that I'll be presenting in Italy in June. That will be published in an edited volume that will go into more detail about that. So there will be something in writing will be available soon. Joshua, thank you so much for the question. Rahab, not the woman, stands alone within the Hebrew Bible as the only sea serpent / dragon that has no extra biblical parallel / cognate from Ugarit or elsewhere. Are there any theories on the etymology / origin of this entity? What is that? Is that Isaiah 53? I think 53:18. No, 53 something, isn't it? Oh no, 51, not 53. 51:9. Cut Rahab in pieces. This is my last dragon. All right, let me see. Where's the name? Rahab. I want to say there's something Egyptian. Rage, violence, raging, surging means surger, plays upon the restlessness and crashing of the sea. Symbolic designation of Egypt. Huh. Yeah, it looks like there are Babylonian Retsushu or Retsusha, the helpers of Kingu and Tiamat. Could be cognate. Yeah, I'd have to look more into that to see what we have there. But the tradition seems to be associated with the idea of, oh, you know who might talk about this? It seems to be discussed or associated with the storm deity's battle with the sea. And so so I bet Ayali Darshan has something to say about that. So there's a book called The Storm God and the Sea by Noga Ayali Darshan from, I want to say 2020. Yeah, 2020. Who talks about this motif. And so I'm just curious if they talk about Rahab in here, because this will give a good... If they do, I think, yeah, there it is, Rahab. Divine name, 149, 159, 160. Let's take a look at that. That's a pretty technical discussion. But Yali Darshan's book is probably going to have one of the better discussions on what's going on with that. But yeah, in terms, oh, here we go. The root Rahab parallels the meaning of the Hebrew root Ga'ah, i.e. be proud, which serves frequently as a modifier of the sea. Yeah, so it's definitely related to this myth, the chaotic sea myth. What kind of watch do you wear? It's Apple Watch. I don't know. I don't remember what generation. Thank you for your suggestion of a history of the Bible, the book and its faith. That's the John Barton book I always recommend. It's been immensely enjoyable and helpful. I'm so glad to hear that. I really enjoyed it as well, and I love it when other people enjoy the things I enjoy. Is Michael Heiser's work related to the Divine Council well regarded in academic/scholarly circles? I would say his dissertation is pretty well regarded. I think some of his more devotional/apologetic work I don't think is really moving the needle of the consensus, and I think he was viewed as a more conservative scholar, but his dissertation was very good. Jesse, thank you so much for the question. How influential do you think extra-biblical literary narratives such as Paradise Lost have been on our conception of the Bible? Very influential. Do we see literary works as a part of the process of renegotiation? Absolutely. I think our concept of hell, for instance, is largely building on a foundation that is, that the mortar of that foundation is stuff like Paradise Lost and Divine Comedy and stuff like that. So, I think that literature feeds into the discourse, the general discourse. And, these days we have people who talk about, oh, remember when the Pharaoh gave Moses his ring? And it's like, you're thinking of the Prince of Egypt. That's a movie. That's not in the Bible. That kind of stuff influences how people talk about the Bible. So there's an awful lot of that kind of stuff in circulation. But thank you for a wonderful question. Vasil, thank you so much for the question. Hello, Dr. Maklelan. Hello. Who would win in a fight, Samson or 3 Nephilim a la Goliath? Interesting question. I think it depends on if Samson is still under God's protection, because Samson was supposed to be sent as a bit of a deliverer, a judge. And even though he's an anti-hero, even though his story is tragic, he did what he was sent to do, which was kill a bunch of Philistines. And so if a bunch of Philistine giants were attacking him, I think his mission would, I think Samson would have to win. But yeah, that would make for an interesting celebrity death match, or maybe just a cartoon of some kind. Guto, thank you so much for the question. Cheers from Brazil. Just to appreciate your work and let your Brazilian fans know that the Estranha Histórica channel does a similar job to yours. Oh, I didn't know that. That's interesting to hear. Big hug to you and Enrique from Estranha Histórica. Muito obrigado. I am looking forward to being in Brazil again at some point soon. I have been to, there were a couple of cities. One was called Chuy, and the other was called Jaguarão, that were either on the border with Uruguay or close to the border with Uruguay, that I used to visit when I was living in Uruguay. And then I've been to Sao Paulo too, which was a wonderful place. I love Brazil, and hopefully my book will be translated into Portuguese. I would love to see that, because I get an awful lot of requests for translation into Portuguese. Thank you for saying hi. Chuck, thanks so much for the question. Thanks for the nerdy discussion of Ra'ah. Can you... Ra'ah, the verbal root for to see. Can you use it in a sentence where we see the Raiders defeat the Broncos? The first time that I ever saw my dad cry was when the Broncos won the Super Bowl. So Raiders defeating the Broncos, my dad usually doesn't cry. He usually yells when that happens. But, I don't know. I got to be honest. I have tried my best not to watch any Broncos games for a couple of years now. And it's helped my mental health quite a bit. Random guy, thank you so much for the question. What are your thoughts on the idea of a Messiah in Judaism? Does this belief emerge after they suffered so much, or are there any other factors? I think the Messiah, the anointed one, we have that idea earlier, prior to the exile, but we also have it in and after the exile. And the only person who's explicitly named and designated a Messiah, in as far as I know, in the Hebrew Bible, in Isaiah 45:1, is Cyrus, who's explicitly referred to as God's anointed one, God's Christ, God's Messiah. So the idea is this concept of an anointed one pre-existed all this great suffering, but it became kind of the hope for this future deliverance. Excuse me, that should be the first time Ra'iti et my father. Yeah, I wasn't conjugating it. I was just using the the root. So yeah, there are concepts of messiahs, King and Messiah as Son of God by John Collins and his wife Adela Yarbrough Collins is a good discussion of early Jewish messianism. Fitzmyer's the one who will come, the one who is to come. The one who is to come is another discussion of early Jewish messianism. You've also got John Collins has written a lot of other stuff on messianism. So yeah, it's absolutely an idea in pre-Christian Judaism, and goes back a ways, but has an awful lot to do. It became more salient in response to the exile. Benjamin, thank you so much for the question. Why doesn't the cannabis etymology not work for the recipes in the Bible? And what plants and effects are intended for the incense's altars? It doesn't work because it's really just based on the similarity of cannabosum to cannabis. But cannabosum has a very secure etymology that comes into Greek, where it's I think it's Kanabu, or no, that's the Akkadian, and it comes into Greek as Kanibo or Kaniba, and there's no need for this theory because we already have an etymological explanation that is a stronger one than the one that is asserted, and also because it requires we just arbitrarily say, no, it's not that Akkadian word, it's this other one that is further away, etymologically speaking. And there's no reason to give preference to that other one. But also, cannabosum is a combination of two different words that occur independently of each other many other times with very similar meanings. And so there's no reason to suggest that this one instance or one or two instances where they come together, suddenly there's this other word that is already out there that is that it is now reifying. Yeah, it's been a while since I've talked about that, but there's a reason that the overwhelming majority of scholars don't accept it. It's because it's not a very strong argument, and it is pretty arbitrary. And as far as what plants and effects are intended, I think it's just intended to give them a little buzz, give them a little high, make it feel like that location is a little more divine, a little more otherworldly, make it feel like they're actually, the presence of God is actually having an effect on their mental state. But I don't recall off the top of my head all of the other ingredients of that. Ryan, thank you for another question. Are the Pharisees a sect? Are the Pharisees a sect influenced by the Persian religion post-exile? I'm seeing a lot of similarities with Zoroastrianism, and even the name sounds like Parsi. Any linguistic connection? No, probably not a linguistic connection there. Certainly, Zoroastrianism exercised an influence on post-exilic Judaism. Still, a lot of questions that are unanswered about exactly what kind of influence it was. If you would like, best discussion on the Pharisees is The Pharisees by Joseph Sievers and Amy Jill Levine. This is going to start with a wonderful discussion of the etymology of the word Pharisees, and then go into a lot of wonderful discussion about how the Pharisees are represented in Josephus, what's going on in the Dead Sea Scrolls, in the New Testament, medieval Jewish ideas, all that kind of stuff. So that's the best discussion you're going to find on what's going on with the Pharisees. Certainly there is some Zoroastrian influence on Judaism more broadly, but I don't think etymologically there's any relationship there. Thank you so much for the super chat, MB the NB. JM, thank you so much for the question. Hi, Dan. I just want to thank you for doing what you do. Cheers, sir. Justin M. Thank you so much. That means a lot. I appreciate it. Mendicant Friar. The Sandy Stone, thank you so much. Line upon line, an appropriate to describe changing D and C over time? Seems it was used as progression, not retroactively change. Would it be inappropriate to point out the mistranslation as blah, blah? I point it out when I'm in circumstances where people bring that passage up. But yeah, a lot of people don't like that I do, but no, I don't think it would be inappropriate. I think it would be perfectly appropriate, and I do it myself. Grays174, thank you for the question. The Handbook of Freemasonry, I paid Brill $300. I did not go to those other places. Has a part about Mormon Freemasonry in the New Religious Movements paper. Have you studied any of that? Very briefly, I think there's a book called Joseph's Temples by Homer. Let me just make sure I have that right. Yes, Homer is the scholar. Michael Homer, published in 2014, Joseph's Temples, The Dynamic Relationship Between Freemasonry and Mormonism. I've read chunks here and there of that. That's the closest I think I've gotten to studying Mormonism and Freemasonry. But yeah, it's definitely interesting, and I hope Brill appreciates that I that I facilitated that purchase for them. I'm kind of upset with Brill because I paid for access to their whole Josephus collection, and then I could never actually access it. And then I sent him an email, and I was like, I have been trying for months to access this, and for whatever reason, I cannot. What's going on? And they said, oh, you're not supposed to be able to purchase that as an individual. That's only institutional. So here's your money back. And I was like, freaking Brill. I could make them so much money, and they got to do me like that. S. Mill, thanks so much for the question. No evidence Paul and Peter even died during the first century. First mention of time and way is 160 CE and apocryphal Acts by their name. Where did they go? Well, they definitely died. When that happened is a matter of tradition, but the best we can do is just look at the data that have come down to us and just try to figure out what makes the best sense of those data. And I think most scholars say that we don't really have a reason not to think that they died in the 60s in Rome. So I think that is a tradition that, while it's a tradition, also just kind of makes the best sense of the data until somebody comes up with a better explanation of what happened that scholars agree makes more sense. NB the NB, thank you for another question. How theoretically was Adonai able to go into Egypt outside his area of power and defeat Pharaoh and the Egyptian gods? So we have an example where Adonai loses home court advantage with the Moabites and loses the battle and must retreat. And then we have the example where Adonai goes into Egypt and judges the gods of Egypt and wins. I think that 2 Kings 3 is an actual attempt to account reluctantly for an actual historical event. There are no data that support the historicity of the Exodus, so I think that is entirely a literary construction, invention. And so they've got one where God lost, and they had to make up the one where God won, when God left their territory in this period when God was understood to be territorial. However, the Exodus tradition probably originates in the 9th or 8th century BCE. Maybe in the northern kingdom, maybe not. But I think the version of it that comes down to us is probably primarily a product of the exilic or post-exilic period where that territoriality is being renegotiated. So that's probably why God is able to win when God leaves home court. Thank you so much for the super sticker, JR. Lauren Peterson, thanks so much for the question. Who is your favorite female biblical figure? Why? I would love to know more about Unia. I think that's a fascinating figure, but we just have this one clause that talks about Unia. I think Deborah is fascinating because the Song of Deborah could be some of the oldest poetry in Hebrew that exists, and it's a fascinating story. I would love to know more about Deborah as a judge and the Song of Deborah and all that stuff. But I'm probably going to have to say Yael. The one who, as part of the Song of Deborah, invites Sisera into her tent and then drives a spike through his head into the ground. Yeah, that's what I'm going to say. But there are a lot of fascinating female biblical figures, and I guess I could say Asherah. Like, If we're talking deities, then it's going to have to be Asherah, but I was assuming you were talking about humans. Noah, thank you so much for the question. How were ancient peeps reading Hebrew not bothered by two creation accounts in Genesis when it would have been more obvious in Hebrew? They're just incentivized to harmonize them. And if you've got an interpretive tradition that allows you to harmonize them, then you ignore it and you move on. This is why, we had an awful lot of people who in the 90s, I am old enough to remember, in the 90s, the idea that you cannot possibly elect an adulterer as president because if he cheats on his wife, he will cheat on his country. And those same people, as well as the children and grandchildren of those same people, are now of the opinion that you absolutely can elect an adulterer as president because you're electing a leader, not a pastor. And so how do you reconcile those? Whatever way you are able to reconcile them, and you move on because you are incentivized to reconcile them. And so they didn't need an awful lot of impetus, and they didn't have to alter the text. If you can come up with a unifying framework to read the text through, and you're like, yeah, good enough for me, then that's all you need. And, we have apologists doing that all the time, reconciling different accounts and saying, see, they can be reconciled. We can move on. Same thing. But thank you for a great question. Glenn, thank you so much. Hi, Dan. Thanks for your work. I appreciate the very kind words. I appreciate you. Glenn. Thank you. If I may ask, Ruth 3:4, Gilit Margalatov, spelling. Who was Ruth uncovering, herself or Boaz? And when he laid down and he knew the place, which he laid down there, and she came and she uncovered. That is just, his feet. And, these are the instructions. Uncover his feet and lay down, and he will tell you what you should do. So she went down. Yeah, it's what is the question again? Who was Ruth? Yeah, it was Boaz. She was uncovering, or she was supposed to uncover Boaz's feet, and this is probably indicative of some kind of intercourse. Feet is frequently a euphemism for genitals, and the idea is, hey, get him drunk, sleep with him, then he'll have to marry you. Although Boaz does kind of say, hey, there's a better way to do this. So we're not sure exactly what was going on there, but probably some kind of intercourse took place. Nathaniel, thank you for the question. Is Matthew 17's mustard seed faith over action? I don't know that it's faith over action. Matthew is pretty emphatic about the need for action. I think it's more a matter of trust. If you trust, then things will go your way, and your trust will grow. So yeah, I don't think it's over action. I think it's just a different element of trust. Beekman, hopefully from Beekman's World. That was a wonderful show. Hi, Dr. Dan. The location of heaven, was it something more literal / geographical? When did it begin to be more of a metaphor? I think you probably had people across the spectrum of belief, but yeah, I think most people thought it was literal. I mean, people think it's literal today. When did it begin to be more of a metaphor? So I think within the New Testament, frequently when they're talking about the kingdom of God, they're not talking about, this otherworldly thing. They're talking about the kingdom of God being achieved here on earth. But yeah, I think pretty metaphor. I don't know that a metaphorical reading is completely taken over, but I think once scientific understanding of the universe began to be understood a lot more widely, that a metaphorical reading began to also become a lot more widely appealed to. But yeah, that's a difficult one. I'd have to look more into that. In fact, I'm going to write that down. Rather than just ramble on in a stream of consciousness way. I will look more into that and get back to you. Tiktalik, episode 3, Revenge of the Fish. Thank you so much for the question. I've seen some sites saying Esther does not come from star, but from a word meaning myrtle, as a translation of her Hebrew name, but I can't find any source that doesn't just claim it. Is there any credit to this? It wouldn't surprise me if there's some kind of relationship, but I think most folks acknowledge that this tradition, or at least the names in the tradition, are descended from Ishtar and Marduk. Give me a second. It could just be a convenient overlap. There we go. 2-7. Yeah, I think most folks agree that even if there is an argument, that might be the Hebrew name Hadassah. Yeah, BDB has Hadassah, meaning myrtle. You're using BDB? Do you have halot? Simone, if you don't have halot, I need to get you halot. Hadassah, yeah. Epithet of Ishtar. Bride just married, epithet of Ishtar. It's convenient. Safaria. So yeah, that it seems like even if we do take that word, which means myrtle, that is also an epithet of Ishtar. So Thomas, thanks so much for the question. Should the Book of Mormon be treated as univocal? It has different writing styles from allegedly different authors, but it's also abridged into one narrative. I think that's an interesting argument, because even from a critical point of view, if you understand it to be a product of the 19th century, is it the product of one author or more than one author? Is it the work of just Joseph Smith, or maybe Joseph Smith has redacted something that he took from someone else or somewhere else? There's an awful lot that is very clearly borrowing from the Bible. And, there's a lot of inconsistency, which may be a result of just poor memory on the part of Joseph. So I think there's an argument to make that it can be read multivocally. There's an argument to be made that it should be read univocally. That's a discussion that I think at least Latter-day Saint scholars are having right now, and I think it's an interesting one. But yeah, great question. Marcio, thank you so much for the contribution. Wolf of the West, thank you so much for the question. As a Christian, do you feel any responsibility for the atheist hate culture in your comment sections that regularly mocks and dehumanizes Christians? I see we have a very robust comment section. I have not been keeping up with it, but I am... Hey, David, welcome. I am not aware of dehumanization. I usually have some very helpful folks from the Discord who will let me know if there are any problematic comments going on. So I'm not aware of. Sorry, and the comments just all reset. And I don't know why I would feel responsibility for an atheist hate culture. I'm not going to deny that there's an awful lot of hatred within the broader atheist community, but that is not my community, and I don't think I'm responsible for what they're doing. But if there are specific comments that you would like to point to and that you think merit some kind of response or disciplinary action, I would be happy to take it. But I'm sorry if you're being attacked. Also, my copy has a box in the PDF that may be hypothetically acquired, but I would never do. But I would never do hypothetically not be searchable and just require a lot of scrolling. I think the one I have is searchable. I'll have to check that out. We'll revisit this. Guto, thank you so much for the question. On The Sacred Canopy from Peter Berger, what are your thoughts? For me, the best book on religion sociology ever. I've heard of it. I don't think I've read it, but I tend to be wary of attempts to try to reduce the sacred to some kind of theoretical model like that. Sociological underpinnings of religion and the rise of a modern secular society. It was a historical social mechanism in the classic work of social theory from 1967. I'm going to say it probably is not aware of all the insights that we've gathered from evolutionary psychology, from cognitive psychology, cognitive science of religion, all the research that has been done since the 80s and 90s. So I have not read it. I'm going to say it's probably not very up to date. And there are probably more robust accounts that are available now. But thank you for bringing it to my attention, as I am going to do what I can to look into it. Elements of a sociological theory of religion. All right. I'm saving that. Thank you. Alan, thanks so much for the question. I saw a paper that put the fulfillment of Ezekiel 38 and 39 during the book of Esther. Thoughts? That's a silly attempt to try to find a fulfillment when there's not really a valid fulfillment. Yeah, I don't think there's much to that. But I'd be interested in see what the argument was. Grace, thank you for another question. Thoughts on Unia being Joanna, wife of Chuza from Gospel of Luke, a la Richard Bauckham, Gospel Women. I'm trying to think if I've heard that argument before. I don't think there's much to that. That's an interesting theory, but that sounds pretty speculative. And I have certainly not. I'll have to look into that. I'm going to be interviewing a scholar on my podcast soon who has written some work on Unia, and I intend to ask her about Unia. And so I will have to bring that up. In fact, writing that down as well. Okay. Thank you for bringing that to my attention. Marcio, thank you so much for the question. Does the New Testament origin from Aramaic? No, the New Testament was originally written in Greek. There's not really a case to make that it represents a translation from Aramaic. A lot of it very clearly was originally composed in Greek. We don't see the signs and indications of translation. Mike on Instagram says, I saw in a recent video you recommended certain teaching Bibles over others. Do you have a recommendation for a child's Bible? Actually, I do. God's Stories as Told by God's Children, an illustrated storybook Bible by the Bible for Normal People. I contributed one of the chapters to this, and I'll read how it's described here. At the Bible for Normal People, we know that how the Bible works is just as important as what the Bible says, and we think kids should know this too. So we created an illustrated storybook Bible informed by biblical scholarship just for them. A storybook Bible that welcomes their questions and views the Bible as the beginning of a conversation, not the end of one, that illuminates the Bible's historical context, embraces its weird bits, and celebrates its many storytellers. And then there were over 50 different biblical scholars, theologians, faith practitioners, and storytellers, myself included, who contributed to this illustrated storybook Bible. So I would recommend this. It's I think does a very good job of sharing the Bible for a young audience without glossing over the problematic parts, but also in a way that where it can be presented appropriately. And then I wrote, my chapter was on, it was 1 Kings 11 and 12, A Kingdom Divided, with some lovely illustrations by Cheryl Orsini. And that was just released, what's today? The 29th, 30th? That was just released 5 days ago, so brand new. But thank you for the great question. James, thank you so much. Love your content. I appreciate it very much. Really eye-opening about tradition. I have a question, if you don't mind. Matthew 7:6, what is your understanding of this? Let me pull it up and see what we've got. Do not give what is holy to dogs, and do not throw your pearls before swine, or they will trample them underfoot. Excuse me, it's bedtime. And turn and maul you. Yeah, the idea here, this is a rather ethnocentric bit of polemic that is probably developing later on in Christianity as Jesus followers are getting a lot of pushback from non-Jewish and non-Jesus followers, and so are just trying to console themselves and say, well, yeah, we're taking our ball and going home, and so you get this, do not throw what is holy to the dogs or your pearls before swine. But yeah, it is polemical. It is unfortunate rhetoric in that part, but Matthew was probably written between 80 and 90 CE, decades after Jesus's death, and there's probably an awful lot that's been going on between the Jesus followers and the others around them, and there's an awful lot that Matthew puts into Jesus's mouth that's kind of engages in polemic against them. Jonathan Edwards, thank you so much for the question. What are your favorite resources for learning epistemology? Well, I generally approach, I've done a lot of study in the theory and methods of the cognitive sciences. I think that's a wonderful foundation for a lot of research. As far as epistemology goes, I don't get too deep into the philosophy of it because that seems to me to never really arrive at many useful conclusions. So I will leave that generally to others, and if there's a consensus that changes, I will adopt that consensus. But for the most part, I try to lean on the scientific method and not worry about deeper questions that are just going to muddy the waters anyway. That bit of Matt is probably also related to the Syrophoenician woman pericope, which is just as bad in Mark as in Matt, if not worse, because Matt's Jesus kind of goes, my bad, which Mark's doesn't. Yeah, that was initially, I was like, wait a minute, this isn't the story of the Syrophoenician woman, but that's where you have the idea of the dogs, don't give the children's food to the dogs. So yeah, and Matthew anyway, is probably written from a Judaizing perspective, so there's probably an awful lot of ethnocentrism going on there. But thank you for the question. But yeah, I tend to find a lot of retreats to epistemological uncertainty on the part, particularly on the part of apologists, to be just insufferable. Cousin Ed, thank you so much for the question. Love how your approach is both scholarly and non-precious. If only you could get your auto captions to consistently spell all right. Well, yeah, that was when I made a T-shirt that said "All right, let's see it." I really went back and forth on how to spell it, and I decided that I would just use kind of the I don't even know what you call it, the like emoji generation kind of shortened one word. All right. It's not standard, but the only thing about which I am a prescriptivist is the Oxford comma, and I will die 1,000 times on that hill. But everything else, I'm a hardcore prescriptivist. Matthew Thiessen has a good paper on that. Gentiles as unclean animals in the early Jesus movement, I think it's called. I wonder if that sounds like something. It sounds like something that Matt would write, but do I have that? No, it doesn't look like I have that. Well, I'll have to look that up. I should bring Matt on the show again to talk about that. I think that would be great, particularly in light of a lot of the ritual purity stuff that has been going on in New Testament studies. All right. Thank you so much, Cousin Ed. Marcio, last question. Thank you so much. What about the book/translation of New Testament from Aramaic to English by Reverend David Bauscher? Is this fake? So no, because there are Aramaic translations of the New Testament, where the New Testament was in Greek, and then it was translated from Greek into Aramaic, and then people translate that Aramaic translation into English. So it's not fake, but it's not the original. It is a translation from the Greek. So any Aramaic version of the New Testament you will ever find is a translation from the Greek. And if it's not, it's because somebody was just making it up on the fly. There is no Aramaic original to the New Testament. Okay, James, promise last question. Don't post any more questions. I will not answer them. But thank you, James. What's your view on the idea that Israel and Judah began as separate groups with unique traditions, later merged during or after exile into the unified narrative of the Hebrew Bible? I think that's correct. There was no single unified kingdom. It was always two separate kingdoms. And then after the northern kingdom was destroyed, I think the southern kingdom appropriated some of those traditions, and we had this tradition develop. And for two good books on this, I would go with Andrew Tobolowsky's The Myth of the 12 Tribes of Israel, and I would go with Jason Staples' The Idea of Israel in Second Temple Judaism, A New Theory of People, Exile, and Israelite Identity. All right, thank you so much, everybody, for your time, for your attention, for some wonderful questions. Yeah, I hope to see as many of you as are able to make it to the book signings that we have scheduled for May, whether it's with the Data Over Dogma tours, the ones that are stopping in Chicago and Seattle and Portland and LA, and then in Dallas and Atlanta and Philly and DC, or in one of my other events in Boston, in New York, in Santa Barbara, in Clarkdale, or in Denver, we'll have two in Salt Lake County, and whatever other events that may pop up. I appreciate your support so much. It means the world to me. It allows me to do something that I just absolutely love for a living, and I'm one of the luckiest people in the world for that. So thank you so much. Hope you have a wonderful morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you happen to be. Hope you have enough food on the table, people around you who love you, and a warm, safe place to spend the night. And I'll see y'all later. Bye, everybody.